Greetings, my fellow knights. Our story tonight takes us onto the Silk Road in the footsteps of Marco Polo. We will feel what it was like to be a merchant turned traveler, crossing seas and deserts, meeting emperors, and carrying tales back to Europe that would shape the world's imagination. This immersive history was created based on the work of Eugenio Buggio's book, Marco Polo, and Angela Schottenhammer's book, China and the Silk Roads, helping us step closer into the world that Marco Polo described. You can find these sources and further reading in the description below. And if you enjoy these journeys, you can help our circle grow by liking and subscribing. In the comments, share what other time or place you would like us to visit together. Now, settle yourself and take a steady breath. The road east begins. Chapter 1. Leaving the Lagoon. Our story begins in Venice. Imagine you are a young merchant in the year 1271, walking the quay as bells ring. Stone underfoot feels steady and the water lies close by, but the head is busy with small sums and simple plans. A father and an uncle speak in low voices, and a name from far away hovers between them like a sign that will not fade. Kublai Khan waits in the east, they say, and there will be a hard trial of will and sense at his court. Danger will come, and duties will test every part of a person, from the first step to the last. That sounds grand when told by a fire, but it lands heavy when the day is still before dawn. But for now, these hours are like any other, and the quay is the same quay it has always been, and the mind returns to ledgers and sacks by the canal. Prices must be checked, a shipment must be watched, and a note must be sent. That is the way of things before a long road begins. It is how people set themselves in order, so they do not break when the first turn comes. A quiet start can carry a long distance, and a steady hand at the start helps more than a bold word said too soon. Venice stands like a net of stone and water, and the work of the day is to find the right strand and follow it without fuss, while the green water shows a slow push and pull against the piles. The city looks fine from a distance, but up close there is plain labor. Boats must be loaded, dates must be marked, and small risks must be weighed. A boy at the corner tries to sell a sweet fig, and a clerk shakes his head because coin is tight. There is no shame in that. A name is not made by spending quickly. A steady man knows that every honest deal has more weight than a boast, and that is the way a path opens. The talk of leaving stirs the stomach now and then, but the feet still move along a known route. A galley rocks in its slot, and ropes groan a little as a crewman leans and makes fast the last knot. So the morning builds its own pace, and the mind learns it again, calm and even. At the warehouse, the day comes into shape in the old ways, and the rough pull of hemp on the palm makes the task feel real as a sack is dragged to the mark for weighing. Father counts slowly, uncle corrects a figure, and a cousin mutters about a trader from across the water who likes to shave a handful from every measure. Small flaws show a person more than big speeches do. A quiet pause between kin says as much as a long talk, and sometimes it says more. Plans are shared in pieces, and a part is held back, not from lack of trust, but from care. The east is too far to hold in the hand, so it is not named every time. The young do not always see why, but they learn by standing near and listening for what is not said. That was our way, and it was not a bad way. Work keeps the body straight, and numbers keep the mind clean, and neither one is a waste. Paper and ink shape the hours, and the faint scratch of the quill on the page sets a beat to the room as accounts are set down neat and steady. There is pride in clean lines, in a column that does not lean, in a final sum that stands slight but true. It is not a story people rush to hear, but it is the story that keeps bread on the table. A small praise from an elder warms more than a large one from a stranger. One line later, a runner comes with a claim about a delay at the dock. It can wait. Haste breaks more than it fixes. There are always men who worry a matter to pieces and call that skill, but they do not carry weight long. The trick is to touch each thing once, not twice, and to leave it better than it was found. In time, that makes a name you can lean on when storms come. It is slow, but slow can be sure. Toward noon, there is talk at the table of roots and favors, and hot wax seals a simple family note that asks for a friendly word to help a passage to the south. A cousin says the road is wide enough for brave feet. An aunt shakes her head and says brave feet also need wise company. Old jokes rise and settle, the kind people use to keep fear from finding a hold. The East is not in the room, but it is in the gaps between words. The map rolls out in the mind, not on the table, and places become more than names. Acre is said like a hinge, and beyond it stand cities no one here has seen. It is a strange thing, how far a life can reach from a narrow lane. Yet the lane still needs sweeping, and the bill still needs paying. That balance is the true craft, not just the trading of goods, but the trading of time for a chance at something more. We learn it step by step, and that is enough for now. Evening comes with quiet light on the stones, and plain bread is held between teeth to steady a restless stomach that would rather rush than wait. The body slows without being told, and thoughts settle into simple rows. An elder says the world is wide, but a man still walks it one stretch at a time. That is a comfort when plans feel larger than the person who must carry them. The stories of the East press forward, and faces of people far away turn into shapes in the mind. They are not enemies and not friends yet. They are neighbors one has not met, that is all. The talk is calm. Pride has no place at this hour, only steady care. There is a small prayer, said without anyone making a show of it. It is a habit, plain as washing hands, and it does not need a crowd. The house settles as the street grows still, and the world shrinks to the size of a lamp, and a last word said at the door. Dawn is a patient visitor, and on the last morning at home, the sky places a thin veil above the canals that the eye reads as promise more than warning. Bags are set near the door, and the young back lifts as much as it can, which is never as much as it thinks. A neighbor comes to say 2 words and grips a forearm kindly, and that grip says what words cannot. Leaving and staying share the same kind of ache, though most people do not admit it. The lane, the step, the swing of a door, all these hold years tucked inside them. Letting go of them is a small piece of courage, and it is good to notice that and not rush past it. The older men do not make speeches, they check a strap and nod. That is how care looks in a hard-working place. No one knows what the road will ask, but they trust a steady habit will answer most first questions well enough. When the time comes, the quay greets the party without fuss, and the oars creak in their locks while the crew calls to one another in the way workers do when hands take up well-known tasks. The city seems to lean in, as if it wants to hear what will be learned and brought back. But cities have no ears, only people do, and people must go find their own answers. The boat nudges free, and the piles slide by, and the small crowd on the stones lifts hands with little waves that say more than formal words. It feels right to keep still and let the moment speak for itself. There is no need to dress it up. The first strokes are the same strokes others have taken for years, and there is comfort in that old path. The bow points toward the open water, and the mind follows, step by step. Ahead lies acre and a blessing, and more work than can be counted now. That is enough to carry into the next stretch, calm as a held breath. Chapter 2, Toward Acre and a Blessing. The sea carried the work forward with a sure push, and the deck moved under steady feet as the galley hugged the line of coast from one safe reach to the next. Salt on the lips told of a fair breeze and the wisdom of staying near land, because that was the way of careful sailors who did not test fate more than needed. A chest sat under a canvas sheet near the mast, and inside lay the letter that bore the name of Pope Gregory the Kents, wrapped in cloth as if it were a new loaf. Kin waited in Acre for news and help, and the letter promised a hearing among men who valued seals and simple words. The crew kept to their places without fuss, and family stayed close to the midships, with hands resting on wood that had been scrubbed smooth by years. Many had said that such papers changed a trip from a gamble into a duty, and there was comfort in duty when waves ran slant against the side. A comrade beside passed a skin of water and smiled like a man who trusted more in habit than luck. The coast slid by village, and small fires ashore showed that others also kept watch over their own nights. That was the balance of things, and travel had to honor it. Order ruled the hours on board, and it kept humors even when days ran long and faces grew tired. The watch woke the rowers by turns, and the helmsman took his marks from headlands he knew as if they were kin he had not seen in years. Smell of tar hung near the coils and planks where repairs had been made, strong and useful in its way, because that sign meant seams would hold in rough water. The captain set the pace without shouting, and the oars dipped and rose in a pattern that seemed older than any one of them. There was a crossbow under a leather cover by the bow, set there to keep strangers honest if they tried to come too near. A small joke made the rounds about the bow having more patience than the crew, and it lightened the quiet hours between meals. Work came first, then bread and a sip, then sleep. That was the path of the day, and it asked little beyond steady hands and a level head. A narrow harbour gave rest one evening, and the crew paid a coin to tie up along a stone quay while the sky went pale. The sound of gulls drifted over the water in short cries, and those notes fit the place like a seal fits wax, simple and firm, reminding all that birds watched the life of men without care for plans. A seller near the water's edge leaned over his stall with olives and dates, and a boy ran errands between baskets for men who wore many kinds of caps. News passed in short bursts, never in full, but even scraps helped shape a picture of the coast ahead. The letter kept in the chest drew respectful nods from a clerk who saw the braid on its ribbon, because seals still mattered when names were not known. A comrade bartered for rope and a spare length of cloth, not because calamity pressed, but because prudence kept crews safe. The harbour master made his mark on a slip and wished fair weather, which was all a man could give beyond his own work. Departure came at dawn, because that was when edges were softer and wind often kinder. A squall tested the nerves 2 days out, and clouds stacked like walls in a way that made even veterans measure their breath. Light burst white along the low horizon and split the sky for a blink, sharp as a cut and gone again, and that flash held the crew still in a quiet that meant respect for the force that moved above them. Orders were given in normal voices, and ropes were eased or made fast as need required. The bow dipped and rose in long motions, no drama beyond work and motion, like a cart on a rutted track that would pass if wheels were kept straight. A man near the mast spoke a simple prayer, not to call down favor, but to steady himself for the next hour. This was not legend, this was muscle and habit meeting water and sky, and that made it almost homely. The chest with the letter was wedged with a spare spar, a small trick used by those who knew how to keep cargo still. The worst of it went by sooner than fear had guessed, as such things often did, and the crew settled back into their pace, grateful without fuss. The walls of Acre rose in their time, and the harbour spread busy and rough with craft of many kinds, each with its own pride and worry. The letter's ribbon felt rough under the thumb while it was taken out and checked for marks, and that small rab steadied the mind, because solid things help in places where words fly thick. A clerk in a dim room near the dock made space on a bench, and the seal did the rest with a quiet power that beat any boast. Kin met outside among bales and crates with brief grins and firm hands, as if to say that family business was its own shelter. A simple meal followed, with hardtack dipped in watered wine to make it go down easy, not as a feast, but as a sign that the body would be kept ready for the road ahead. There had been stories of Acre as a place of bright show and lawless corners, yet the truth sat somewhere in the middle like most towns with busy harbours. A scribe fetched a notary, and steps were set in motion for meeting men who guided permits and passage. It all felt helpful and human, and that counted. The city felt full of tongues and coats, and even the narrow lanes kept a steady flow that made motion seem like a trade of its own. Smell of incense drifted from a chapel off the market, a thin ribbon that seemed to rise over quarrels and deals, and it fit the mood of a visit meant to draw a blessing for the road. A friar greeted the party with care, not asking for long tales, but checking the seal and hearing the names of father and uncle as if he had held them before in his mind. The letter from Pope Gregory the Kents was set on the table and read in a low voice, each line treated like a step to be taken, not a trumpet call. Guidance was given, not grand but useful, about way stations and men who could be trusted not to grasp too hard at purses. A small sign of the cross followed, and a palm on a shoulder, warm and without show, as if to say that courage is a plain thing, built choice by choice. The friar added one word about care, and then sent 2 lads to carry messages to the harbour office. Blessings did not make roads shorter, but they put fear in a smaller place, and that helped good sense hold its ground. Several days in Acre passed in steady work, because journeys were not won by bold thoughts but by ready boards, full skins and clear papers. Warm stone under the palm on a sunlit stair gave a pause one afternoon, and the hand stayed there a moment to draw a bit of peace, which was worth more than showy vows. Kin argued over routes as families will, not out of anger, but to press the plan until weak parts showed and could be fixed. A local agent with a neat beard proved fair, and he set down names of caravans that kept faith in rough country, because those names could mean the difference between safe passage and loss. Men came and went with talk of ports to the south and islands to the west, yet the sense of the thing pointed east, where duty called and a great Khan waited beyond deserts and slopes. There were jokes over wine about sand in boots and the stubbornness of camels, more to ease the mind than to mock what lay ahead. A boy sent by the friar brought a small token, a scrap of cloth with a mark of blessing, which was tucked into the chest beside the letter. Steps had shaped now, and that brought calm. Departure came without fanfare, as was proper for work that had to be done with care and patience rather than heat. A bell on a nearby quay gave one soft note as the lines were cast off, a sound that slipped over the water without strain, and it nudged thoughts forward in a kind way. The captain nodded to kin and made a small sign, and then the oars moved again as if they had never rested. The letter from Pope Gregory the Kent sat where it had sat from Venice to Acre, now with a new blessing laid across it, like a hand, and that mix of paper and faith seemed the right blend for a road that would ask for both trade and trust. The harbour thinned behind, and the ship turned to pick up the coast that would lead toward other reaches and, in time, the long bend around lands that ended near Hormuz. Stories had promised a smoother way, but experience had taught that smooth paths often hid their own traps, so a steady heart was the better plan. Faces on deck looked ahead and did not blink too often at what might come. The work of travel went on, quiet and sure. Chapter 3. Turning from the sea at Hormuz. Hormuz had stood like the end of a rope, where the line from Venice tied off and asked what came next. The harbour lay crowded with hulls that had known too many hands, and the quays held men who knew more of currents than of promises. Masters spoke of summer storms and timbers that had been patched once too often, and the wiser heads shook when asked about a long crossing. The choice felt plain when frames were thin, and the gulf ran long. The road inland had danger, yes, but it had rules that traders understood. A caravan had space for pace, and a chance to mend small errors before they grew. The sea, with weak boards, allowed no such mercy. The company stood together and counted the loads that could be carried, then looked east by the line of the low hills. The world often asked for a step back before it gave a way forward, and that was how it seemed here. The letter carried from Acre sat safe, and the goal at the far court did not grow smaller because a ship proved feeble. A good path could be walked by steady feet. The shipyard gave its own truth with the smell of pitch that hung around every plank, and that told as much as any elder's word. The caravan master came with a lean face and an easy manner, the type who knew when a man tried to hide fear with too many questions. He did not boast, and he did not rush, and that was the tone the whole string of camels took from him. Deals were made in the shade of a wall, coin counted with care, and promises set out in simple terms. A guide out of Hormuz would take the first weeks, and another near Kerman would join by agreement. Camels kneeled to show a clear back for the loads, and rope lay in neat coils by habit. One guard walked the line and kept a quiet tally of strong backs and tender feet. A scribe from another party nodded when the route was named, and it eased the heart to hear that others had passed that way in recent months. There were no loud claims, only steady talk and the work of packing. Truth often came wrapped in patience, and the wise knew that speed without care carried its own cost. A camel's breath warmed a sleeve when a nose pressed close, and that small living weight gave comfort without a word. Loads were set out on cloth to judge weight in the open court, and the balance of the party rested on small choices. A bolt too many now meant a man too tired later, and the road did not pay back pride. Waterskins were checked for seams, and sealed where a stitch had gone thin. A chest was opened and shut, and a few keepsakes were left behind with a quiet laugh, because memory weighed nothing, and space did. The letter for the great Khan was tied within a pouch, and worn under tunic and belt, close to the ribs, where it asked for careful steps. The master watched with a calm eye, and he was kind in his way, guiding hands without insult. A comrade nearby did the old test of a load by the lift of the knees, and the measure set itself without quarrel. It was not grand work, but this was how long roads began, with small knots pulled tight. The mind often rested better when tasks were plain and done in order. A leather strap creaked when a knot was hauled firm, and that single sound felt like a promise kept. The first miles out of Hormuz ran across open ground that gave little shade and less favor, and the pace settled into what men could bear. The master set rules that had been learned by others before. The young walked ahead of the oldest, the sick did not lag alone, and halts came by the hour rather than by the whim of pride. Sand rolled under sandals, and Prince showed the line of the party for a short time before they went soft. Camels moved with that rolling grace that saved strength, and their patience taught its own lesson without speech. The road rose and then steadied, and the small line of earthworks that kept a bit of water in a ditch showed that people had lived and made plans here for years. A child from a village grinned at the strange speech and then ran off, and a woman at a doorway held bread in her hands and watched the passing. The company did not take more than was fair, and it paid when it could, because trade always went farther than force. Faith in simple rules held tighter than hope in luck most days. The heat pressed on skin and asked for careful breath, and that set the day's rhythm without argument. Evening brought walls, not of a town but of a resting place raised for the long road, and that square yard kept wind off the animals and gave men a place to sit. Travelers from the west and from the east shared space without fuss, because the path made a family where none had been planned. The cook pot went out with little ceremony, and rice with a few bits of meat went in, because hunger did not judge. Stories were told without show, short notes of who had met what, and where the wells sat close to the path. A blanket went over the writing pouch, and a belt lay under a head, because a man slept better when what mattered was near. It was not comfort as a city gave, but it was enough, and it kept spirits steady for what came next. Laughter rose once and then fell, and someone prayed in a low voice near the gate, because each heart carried its own way of asking for help. The name for that lodging, a caravanserai, fit the need like a glove, and it had earned its place on this long road. The rice tasted plain, and plain food often felt kinder than rich food when miles lay ahead. Morning and the next day tied together by the rope of routine, and the caravan eased into the habits that kept it safe. The master put a steady man at the front to hold the line, and another at the rear to watch for stragglers and to mend small breaks before they grew large. Hands checked girths without being asked, and eyes looked not for danger alone but for the small signs of a path well chosen, like a scrap of dung not yet dry, or a blackened circle that marked last night's fire by other travelers. A hill rose, and the line shortened, then stretched again on the far side, the way a snake moves when it goes from stone to soil. Patience made the day gentler than luck ever did. Talk came and went without plan, and the same jokes found new life, because fear liked humor to sit nearby. Two men counted the days to Kerman by stones they had learned to mark in the mind, but they did not boast of speed, because haste often paid with pain. The bell on the lead camel rang with a small even note, and its regular beat kept steps honest. Kerman did not rise like a capital, but it held craftsmen who made strong things and people who knew the price of a day on the road. The party entered by a gate where a man with a ledger made a mark and asked a simple fee, and there was no trouble, only custom done in its turn. Cloth was shown to a broker who had a careful eye, and he spoke in a short way that wasted nothing. A comrade bought a cheap pair of sandals and claimed that his old ones had held longer than reason, and the joke found its floor and then passed. Water had to be bought and set in jars, and men smiled when the price felt fair, because fairness made the heart lighter than a coin did. A map sketched in chalk on a wall by an older traveler showed the bends of the road ahead, and minds held the shape of it well enough to trust the next week. Advice came from a woman who had kin at a hamlet near the line of hills. She asked for a blessing in return, and got it with thanks. The city did what cities did. It took, it gave, and it moved on. A sip from a deep well tasted faintly of earth, and it told that the ground itself could be a friend when treated with care. The land began to lean upward after Kerman, and the caravan put in shorter hours to match the pull of the slope. The master kept the rule of starting before first light and halting when the day grew long, because men and beasts had limits that needed respect more than pride. The talk among the line went to matters that held the mind in a steady frame. Small news of kin, a proverb given by an elder in a village, a plan to mend a strap with a better knot. A young guard asked about the far court to the east and whether a man could rise by diligence alone, and the answer came in the shape of a story about service, given without asking much in return. That was the road's common wisdom, and it mended fear better than drink. The party had learned when to close ranks for a narrow pass and when to relax for a broader valley, and that quiet skill was worth more than show. The hills did not demand heroics, they asked for care. The world kept steady for those who walked steady. A silvery wind hissed in ears as it slipped around rocks, and its even tone made the line feel joined rather than alone. Chapter 4: Bandits in the Pamirs. The caravan had climbed into the Pamir passes by slow stages, and the line of animals stretched along the track like a rope laid over stone. There had been a steady rhythm to the march, with halts to breathe and check straps, because that was the way to keep men and beasts steady in hard country. At a bend where the path narrowed, the scouts gave a sign, and the talk in the line stopped. Then it came, sudden and thin over the slope, the twang of bowstrings which told the truth before anyone spoke. That sound meant riders watched the train and tried the first cast, as such riders did when they judged a caravan worth a risk. A captain near the front raised an arm, and the handlers began to draw the camels inward, team by team, forming a rough ring where the ground allowed. It was work done many times on dusty tracks, and the body knew the steps before the mind caught up. A knee pressed a camel down, ropes were passed, and bales were tugged into a low wall. You looked along the line and saw calm faces set to tasks, because fear was best turned into motion. It was no surprise in those hills, and knowing that helped steady the heart. Riders edged along the slopes in loose knots, each man moving with the land rather than against it, and a few showed at the crest before swaying out of sight. A boy who held to the spare pack animal pointed with his chin, and the uncle at your side nodded once, as if to say it fit the tales told at the fire. The men shadowing the train worked in and out, never staying still, and they rose in their stirrups to send arrows on long arcs that searched for weak places. One raised a curved length of horn and wood into view, a composite bow held as lightly as a merchant holds a quill, and the captain marked the skill without a word. The ring held, because rings held when hands trusted one another. Movement did the work of courage, and so hands stacked loads, checked knots, and made the wall firmer. There was no show in it, only the plain truth that travel needed quiet strength. You breathed slow and kept to your place, because the surest sign of steadiness was to do the next simple thing. The camels bent their legs and sank into tall heaps, and men eased packs down to build a barrier that covered knees and bellies, which mattered more than grand plans up there. No hero tale could match the practical line of bodies behind bales, so each person found cover and kept eyes to the gaps, knowing that was the way to make it through a day. The guards at the breaks in the wall set their long shafts at an angle, a spear point ready where a horse might try to push in, and they spoke in short phrases to keep minds clear. One man set a bundle of spare shafts at your feet and gave a look that meant watch the hands, not the sky. A camel turned its head toward the ring and worked its jaw, and the musky breath reached the nearest men as a reminder that beasts and people pulled together when trouble came. It was not a fine parade ground scene, but a heap of small skills fitted one to the next. Stories told by sailors back at Hormuz had not carried this weight, but you understood things better now. The ring waited, and waiting had its own kind of strength. The first arrows came in and stuck in cloth and wood, and a bale burst along its seam so that grain poured like a narrow stream, but the line did not break because it held on habit. Men pressed low and lifted shields cut from old crates, and one of the older guards watched the slope more than the arrows, which was another lesson learned by hard days. A merchant from Kerman, quiet all morning, drew a short bow, set a shaft, and sent it back with no fuss, and several others did the same without wasting breath on praise or worry. You passed a rope to a handler and set your weight to a knot, and the rough hemp bit into your palm as if to remind you that hands had work to do in a world that often did not care for shining plans. A comrade beside slid a bale to close a gap, and someone murmured a name under his breath, not as a cry but as a steadying habit. The uncle touched your shoulder once and moved to a break in the ring because older bones knew where to stand. The work carried its own kind of courage, and that was enough to keep the mind clear. The riders chose the low side and pressed in with a small rush, and the line bristled where the ground sloped, for that was where a push would come if it came at all. The guards at the gap stepped forward half a pace and set their feet, and the riders leaned, turned, and drew in the same motion to send more shafts, which was their trade. One man reached with a hook toward a lead rope, hoping to jerk a camel into panic, but a guard slid his point across and checked the reach before it found a hold. You saw how the bandits tried the wall, not with one heavy blow, but with touches here and there, looking for loose places. And it made sense in a hard land where losses were paid for in family grief. The ground kept the ring tight, and the team adjusted one bale and then another to match each new try, because small fixes made strong lines. Hooves beat the slope as the riders pulled away from the brace of points, and the rhythm of the charge faded as they curved back out of range. The captain lowered his arm and called for patience, and patience did more than bold words in a place like that. The day did not care for pride, only for steady work. There came a quieter stretch while the riders traded places and checked their saddles, and in that time the handlers shifted loads, brought a little water, and dressed a shallow cut on a packer's arm with clean cloth. The man kept his jokes to himself, which said as much as any complaint, and he stayed in the line without asking for praise, because that was the way of grown men on the road. Along the slope, one horse stumbled at a hidden step, and the rider rolled and scrambled behind a rock, so the pressure eased for a moment. A boy who had kept count of the arrows stuck in the wall muttered numbers he could not help but say, and the uncle told him to save breath, which helped more than scolding. You watched the nearest bale where the skin of a water skin leaked, and a dark stain spread on the cloth like a slow bruise, which was a sign that nothing stayed neat in a fight. The line shifted to cover the space, and hands that had never wished to be brave managed it anyway. It felt like a long hour, though it may have been shorter, and memory stretched such moments into longer shapes. The mind learned in a quiet way, and quiet lessons lasted. When the riders came again, they did not push in one place, but skittered along the ring and tried to draw the guards into pursuit, which was a trick as old as the hills. A few in the ring took 2 steps and stopped, then stepped back in unison, and that small show told the riders there would be no silly chase. A calm man at the gap raised his shaft, and 2 others followed, and the points set a line the horses noticed, for animals knew more than some men. You stayed low by the bale and kept passing shafts and stones to the hands that needed them, and the work kept the mind from running ahead to foolish what-ifs. One rider swung his blade at a dangling tie and almost caught it, but a guard pushed the knot back with the butt of his shaft, and the motion was as tidy as shop work. The bandits sent a last spread of arrows, more for show than hope, and the ring sent a few back and then let the silence grow. The taste of dust sat on your tongue in a dry weight, and it felt like a small tax that travel demanded of anyone who wished to learn. The line did not boast, it just held. At last a rider on a tall pony raised a strip of cloth and circled wide, and the others followed his lead, because small bands did not waste men on stubborn walls. The captain kept the ring tight for a long count, and then he let men stand and stretch, which felt like a gift after close work. A pair of scouts went a little way to watch the edges, and the rest put hands to the tasks that followed trouble, because that was how roads were kept. You checked the nearest loads, tied fresh cords where old ones had frayed, and made a note in your head about which goods drew eyes in bad places. A man from Balka found 2 arrows intact, and set them by the bale for later trade, and no one laughed at the thought, because a road sent needs both ways. The uncle spoke of the next valley, where a wider floor might let the train move in a longer line, and that thought eased tight shoulders. Hard minutes made the next hour feel fairer, as if the world had paid you back a little for keeping order. The mountain did not promise kindness, but it often kept a bargain. Chapter 5. Posts and Pisa to Kashgar. After the high passes, the first royal post house stood near a slow brook, and the road finally made sense again. A keeper in plain coat stepped out when a badge was shown, the small Pisa hanging by its cord like the key to a locked world. He took it in both hands, nodded once, and waved for rest to begin. A clay bowl was set down, and a spoon followed, simple things that meant strength. The broth tasted of mutton and salt, and it settled the stomach after a raw stretch. That was how the empire worked out here, not with speeches, but with a bowl and a horse given without fuss. You sat quiet while the keeper tallied what mounts were due, and who in the group needed them most. A comrade beside glanced at the door, already thinking of distance gained by morning. The keeper asked for the route and wrote a short mark in his book. It felt like a small-town ritual, done under a wide sky, and the fear from the last pass eased. That was the way of things. The road forward used the yam, the relay that made one route into many short leaps, each one carried by a fresh beast. A rider did not own a horse so much as borrow speed and move it along to the next yard. The keeper fetched the animals and checked girths the same way every time, with a clean habit that came from rules. Hooves drummed in a steady beat when the group pushed off from the yard, a sound that said work would be done today. You took comfort in that simple note, like a metronome under the day's count. Stations stood a day's ride apart, near water and grass, and they made the space feel smaller without tricks. The Paisa showed the right to draw what was needed, but it also carried weight to behave. Riders with orders came and went, and the few with longer loads gave way to them. It was not magic. It was a plan carried out by many hands. That was the way of things. The land flattened into long lanes of scrub and pale soil, with low hills holding the horizon, and the ride became a page that turned itself. The saddle tried to bite at first, then gave in as the body settled into the job again. The leather and the horse carried a clean, sharp smell that mixed with dust and stayed with the coat. A felt tent behind the post house folded easily, and a pack sat right again as straps were fixed by habit. It was not glamour, but each small act made the miles less heavy. The keeper at the next station saw the Paisa, not the face, and that lowered any talk. Faces changed, the signs stayed. A boy led grain to the mounts, and the grain spoke of land and water, and how far this rule had reached. A monk, a merchant, and a courier waited under the same shade, and no one asked many questions. The road taught a simple truth. Order came from shared lines, not loud claims. That was the way of things. Evenings at a post were quiet, with a low brazier and a ring of stools, while a host counted the next day's needs. A lad brought a pot, and an older woman mended a strap with steady fingers, the kind of care that held journeys together more than any bold tale. Heat from the brazier pressed warm against the palms and made the joints loose again. Stories ran around, and they were plain and short, like water passed along a line. There were talkers who swore the West held lakes of gems and hills of gold. There were riders who said the passes ate men like wolves. You listened and remembered that most days were work, and work had its own peace. A light joke about tired mounts drew a few smiles, and that eased the room too. The keeper pointed to the sleeping loft when the talk drifted, and he hung the Paisa above his desk the way a lock is placed on a chest until morning. Rest came like a duty, and that was good. That was the way of things. At mid-morning, a pause was made to write a short notice for the next yard, just a line about water on the road and a broken plank on a bridge. Someone handed a reed and a scrap, and care was taken to keep the marks simple and clear. The ink shone dark on the page until it dried, and the piece was folded to ride with a courier. The Paisa gave the right to ask, but the same sign meant giving back small things like this, useful to those behind. You did not make speeches about service in a yard of straw. You made a note to save a beast or a man a stumble. The keeper thanked the group with a nod, and that was good enough. Another neighbor at the table said the route had been hard last moon, and lighter now, and the group believed it because he had no reason to boast. The road taught that truth moved best when it carried a task with it. That was the way of things. The land thickened as Kashgar drew near, and long lines of poplars showed where water ran and where people had made a home. Low walls guarded orchards, and the fields held men and women who worked without much talk, each hour shaped by the sun and the ditch. Bread baked on hot stones near the lanes, and the smell of it came across in soft waves when the wind turned. Traders with small carts matched pace with the group for a time, then peeled away towards side gates. A man from the hills asked about the badge and said he had seen its like only once before. The reply was simple. It helped the road serve all who had a job to do. There was no need to make the thing seem larger than it was. Simple marks could carry far if enough people respected them. The orchards made it clear that peace was not an idea here. It was the running water and the hands that placed trees in the ground. That was the way of things. One station short of Kashgar, the last keeper took the Paisa and weighed it in his hand the way a carpenter weighs a tool, then wiped it and checked the edge with care. He said the rule was to change mounts at the yard, not on the road, and to bring back any beast that faltered to those who knew how to heal it. The Paisa gave rights and set limits, and both sides mattered if the line was to hold. Metal touched wood and gave a small, neat clink when he set it down, a sound that meant the talk had ended and the law had begun. You signed your name the way you had in other yards, simple and clear, and the keeper did the same. He told the boy to saddle ponies used to the track toward the city and to keep the pace easy for the last leg. No one argued. The rule was fair, and fair rules kept weak men from taking more than they were due. It felt good to be part of a thing that worked. That was the way of things. The final ride eased into long gardens and low lanes, with mud walls that held in shade and kept out wind. A small garrison post sat near a crossroad, and a clerk looked up when the Pizer was shown, then sent a note ahead toward the city gate. The company drew close together to keep count, while thoughts moved ahead to stables and water and one good rest. Far off, a thin dust line marked riders on the horizon, a faint sign that others were moving with order and purpose. There would be talk tomorrow of joining a patrol for the stretch across the grasslands to the east, because shared roads asked for shared guard. You were not the only one carried by this web of posts. It held many, and that knowledge steadied the mind. The gate would meet the group soon, and a clerk there would decide the next hour. The badge made that talk simple. A bed and a plan lay near enough to touch. That was the way of things. Chapter 6. Step Patrol Clash. The grassland had stretched in a wide floor, and the baggage train had moved in a long line as a Mongol patrol kept pace on the open side. The post road had faded into tracks, and talk had turned to wells, hills, and how many days it would take to reach the next town. The patrol leader had a calm way about him, and the men who rode with him watched the edges more than the center, which told what mattered out there. A thin stain of dust lay on the far horizon, and some of the trainmen kept glancing at it while pretending to fuss with straps, because habit learned in hard places had its own rhythm. There had been no alarm yet, but a sense of weight lived in the group, as if a hand rested on the back and held it steady. Even in that, faith in order felt real, because a patrol under the Great Khan's seal meant rules on the road, and rules helped hold fear in place. A comrade beside had muttered that the steppe liked to test strangers, and that may have been true. It was the way of that wide country to ask a price before it gave ease. The dust line had grown thicker, and then small shapes broke from it, not brave enough to rush, light enough to turn quick, and that spoke of riders who hunted the edge of a train. The patrol leader lifted his arm and pointed, and the men braced as he sent them forward and made a wedge, with himself at the point and two files falling back on each side. This shape faced the danger while keeping the center together, and such order steadied every heart nearby, because a neat line did more than a loud oath. The trainmen closed ranks without orders, showing sense built on old travel. The riders who watched from afar tested the flanks, then drew closer, then pulled back, like dogs that were not sure of a gate. The wedge held its pace, not too fast, not slow, and the leader's hand never shook as he gave signs. The first clear note of trouble was the thud of hooves drumming across the hard earth, a sound that made thoughts line up whether one wished it or not. Arrows were set ready, and the patrol did what it had been taught to do long before any of us had crossed those plains. Men stood in their stirrups, bodies turned at the waist, and the first loose came at a space that kept the enemy close enough to worry, far enough to stay safe a moment longer. The short curve of the composite bow fit the work at speed, and the patrol used it smooth, almost like a habit from childhood. No one shouted for glory, because that was not how they fought. It was a craft, done clean. A light arc of shafts moved out and bent the lead riders away, and the point of the wedge pressed on just enough to hold the choice open: come close and risk a cut, or turn and give ground. A hand near mine flinched as the string bit the glove and left a hot line on the finger, a small price that a man pays without complaint because the work matters more. That was the way of such fights, small pains banked to keep large harm away. The raiders tried to circle and found the flanks there first, because the leader split the wedge with a quick sign and let two wings slide to the edges like doors closing on a draft. It looked simple, but had weight behind it, and one could tell this was not a new trick for these men. The left side pressed to hold the raider's turn, the right side drifted out to make a hook, and in that space the point kept steady. A boy in the train clung to a pack strap and watched with his mouth set, learning a kind of lesson not taught in a house. A small red banner flickered above the leader's head when he wanted both wings to move at once, and the men obeyed without a word. because on the steppe a strip of cloth could speak more clear than a long speech. The enemy had come to worry the edges of a fat line of goods, and instead found a clean door closed in front of them. It seemed harsh but fair, which is often how strong order feels in wild ground. When the time came to end the guessing, steel was pulled free, and the leader gave a push with his heels that sent the point forward, as if a lock had slipped. The first line kept arrows for a breath, then the men put bows away and drew the saber in one smooth move, learned through years of hard practice at a trot. The enemy tried to break away clean, then turned to face, and the point caught them before they found comfort. A few clashes at the edge looked wild to eyes new to the steppe, but even there the lines held shape, and this made the difference. A man near me slashed once, then fell back a horse length to keep the file straight, because steadiness counted more than a single blow. The wind carried dry grit up from the churned ground, and dust sat thick on the tongue like chalk that a man endures until the work is done. It was a rough minute, but the rule held: press, cut, and then pull back into line, so the next man could do the same. Back by the train, the caravan master had done what needed doing when first signs showed, and that saved us the worst kind of trouble. Carts had been drawn tight in a half ring, camels turned inward to calm them, and the few guards placed at the gaps with long poles and short blades to make sure no stray rider found a hole. The women who kept the packs straight did their part, handing a sling stone or a water skin as needed, not wasting words because habit and dignity both kept their hands steady. One old driver kept speaking to his team in the same tone he used every day, as if to tell them the world stayed in order, and beasts listened to such truths. The air near the tack lines held the smell of oiled leather that rose from worn straps, a plain scent that felt like work done right. There was fear, yes, but fear did not rule, because simple tasks, done in the set way, drew it out like a thorn. The push and pull ran its course, and then the enemy took heed of what had met them and began to thin like smoke when wind turns. The leader let his men chase no more than a bowshot, then reined them in, because a wise man on the steppe never emptied his hand for a small gain. One rider had gone down when a horse stumbled, and he ended in our grasp with a face both proud and tired. His hands were bound, but not cruelly, and when he asked for a drink, it was given, since even foes shared that much on dry plains when lives twisted. The patrol leader spoke to him through a man who knew both tongues, and the sense of it was clear enough. The road was under guard, and harm would bring hard cost. A light wind moved over us and brushed cool across the cheek, and even that small ease told the body it could believe in calm again. Mercy and firm words made a pair that day, as they often should. By late light, the train found a soft rise near a stream, and the patrol set a loose ring around us in an easy way that did not frighten the horses. The count of goods and people turned out fair, and the wounded were tended without fuss, because hands that travel far learn to keep still in small storms. The talk at the fire stayed low and simple, about the road ahead, the next post, and the word that Kublai Khan liked to know how his roads worked in all their parts. The leader came by to trade a few thoughts about tracks and towns and to nod once at the pack with the letter, which told me the work had to go on, clash or no clash. He said a patrol's duty was to leave a road better at dusk than it had been at dawn, and that felt like a rule one could keep. The crackle of the fire was soft under the mild night, a homely sound that wraps a camp like a blanket. We slept easier than expected, and the way east waited with its steady patience. Chapter 7. Work in Khan Balik. The days in Khan Balik settled into a steady line of duties that began in the city halls, where paper notes passed from hand to hand, seals pressed into soft clay and onto the paper money, and clerks checked the marks again and again before sending a runner across the courtyard. Names were read out, burdens weighed, and routes agreed with a nod and a scratch of the brush. The smell of ink rose from the desks and seemed to hold the room together like quiet glue. What had sounded like a legend back in Venice now looked like the usual work of a vast household, only stretched across a wide land. There were no grand speeches, only clear orders and careful notes. A comrade beside leaned close to compare a figure and then stepped back, steady and plain. A clerk laughed once at a small mistake and changed the mark with calm hands, and no one minded, because a long road forgave small slips. This was not a tale of gold piled high, but of carts, stables, and time, and that had its own weight. That was the way of things. When the summons came, the court received the report without fuss, and the ruler listened as if a farmer checked a field. Kublai Khan asked how the roads held after the last rains, how many days the freight took, and whether the post houses kept fodder enough for the next line of riders. The sight of a plain map lay open on the low table, and his hand rested on it as he spoke in an easy voice. There was no rush to please him with big words. He wanted what could be walked, counted, and proved. A steward waited at the edge and noted each answer in neat strokes. You explained where carts bogged, how a bridge might be set on firmer piers, and which market sent good grain at a fair rate. He nodded at simple sense, not at polish. Those hours felt like a gate swung open after a long ride, because the work stayed clear. That was the way of things. Back at the offices, the tasks grew into paths across the city and beyond. Runners came with a worn tablet pass, and stable hands read it at a glance before handing over the next mount. The scrape of the brush along the paper marked each transfer in quick lines that any postkeeper could read. A clerk checked stores for carts and rope, and someone else took measure of sacks for grain. When the weight ran light, a note went up to call supplies from another storehouse, and it moved along the chain without fuss. The paper money paid drivers who did not want to carry metal on long roads, and a scribe showed how each mark matched an order on file. It was not fancy, but it worked, and the better it worked, the less any person had to think about it. You learned that order spared effort, and there was comfort in that simple lesson. That was the way of things. The city itself pressed in close to the halls, full of talk and trade, and work often pulled the feet through its lanes. Granary keepers asked for carts, weavers sought thread from the north, and merchants waited for rulings on quarrels over late loads. The taste of hot tea steadied the hands when an elder clerk poured it and set the cup near the ledgers before the next group stepped forward. At a market stall, a baker asked whether the post would carry flour at the old rate for winter, and he got a straight answer with a kind word, because a fair word travelled fast. Not every person agreed with every rule, but once a clear path was set, most followed it, because life had to move. You saw small kindness pass between strangers, as often as hard bargains, and that balance kept the city from shaking apart. It was not a story told to impress, yet it was strong. That was the way of things. From time to time, the desk gave way to the road, and an escort waited at the gate, while the horses stood saddled and ready. A list of stations went into a sleeve, and the plan was to ride, look and ask, not to judge before seeing. The feel of saddle leather under the hand reminded the mind to stay practical and steady. Post keepers met the party with plain bows, and cooks set bowls in front of everyone because word had come ahead as it always did. Bridges were checked, and bends in the track marked where carts slowed to a crawl, and notes went down while the pebbles clicked under hooves. At each stop the same questions rose: fodder, water, roof, and road. A young rider joked about the dust, and the laughter eased the miles, which helped more than fancy talk ever could. You learned to weigh a promise by how it matched the ground. That was the way of things. Back in the hall, merchants brought their worries to the table and waited for clear rulings. Some carried coin from far ports, others held paper notes, and all wanted to know how to trade one for the other without loss or trickery. The click of counting sticks on the desk kept time, while facts were checked and rules restated, so every ear heard the same words. When one deal seemed bent, a clerk called on a witness, and tempers cooled because the guard at the door did not favor one side. You saw that trust was not built in a day but grew when rules were known, and when words matched deeds. The ruler asked for results, not talk, and that set the tone for all below. It was simple enough, yet it took steady hands to keep it going. You felt the worth of small fairness added up over many days. That was the way of things. Life did not pass only in offices and on roads, because a city as large as this one held its own hours of ease. On a rest day, lanterns floated along a garden pond, and children leaned over the edge to point and laugh, while elders sat on benches and told old tales. The sight of lantern light on water made the place feel like a calm courtyard even though the walls lay far away. A singer plucked a tune, while a guard nearby tried to hum, and a few of us shared flat noodles from a stall that had become a regular stop. Jokes passed about slow scribes and fast horses, and no one took offense because we all knew both types were needed. You saw that a great court rested on ordinary joy as much as on orders and weighty seals. The heart took stock on such evenings and steadied itself for the next load of work. That was the way of things. In time, the talk in the hall turned toward the sea, and the request reached the desk with the weight of a promise that could not be set aside. There was a task to carry messages and goods by ship, and there was a matter of honor tied to a bride bound west under guard. The smell of tar on new ropes at the river docks told that ships were being rigged for long days beyond the coast. A steward asked for names to sail, and a list of ports to call at was laid out, with care taken to match season and wind. You were told that the road might be water now, and that order would follow there as well if patience guided the hand. The city had become familiar, but the line of duty led outward again, as it always did when trust had been earned. We packed ledgers and light gear, and gave thanks for steady ground. That was the way of things. Chapter 8. Pirates on the Sea Road. The harbour at Quanzhou lay behind as the river mouth widened and the sea took hold of the hull. The big Chinese junk rode steady, its ribs tight and its planks pegged with care, and the crew worked with a habit that had been learned young. A clerk kept a tally of jars and bolts, while a guard crew checked the quiver box by the stern rail and nodded to the officer who watched the wake. It had been a long road from the court, and the sea road promised speed and risk in the same breath, as most roads did in those years. The route had its rules, and a convoy shared more than water. It shared nerves and a kind of trust. Spray touched the face as the bow lifted and fell, and that small proof of salt reminded the mind to stay clear. A simple plan guided the day. Keep formation, keep space to turn, keep men fresh. That was the way of things when miles were counted by patience. Traders talked of far mouths that would drink wine from the bowls in the hold, and of letters that would find old friends. A few words about pirates passed in low voices, more out of custom than panic. Even so, a thought of iron hooks and quick boats sat at the edge of the talk, like a shadow that kept folk honest. By midday, the ships held a tidy line, each hull set so that no one was blind to the others, and the captain paced to keep the spaces even. Orders had been short and plain since dawn, and that kept fear from growing taller than the work. A helmsman counted strokes under his breath, and a young hand coiled lines without being told twice. The guard crew at the stern checked their kit yet again, and they did it slow, not to waste time but to keep the mind steady. This was not the Silk Road under hooves and boots, but the sea road had its own steps, and each step needed a body ready to shift. A brother beside checked the bundles of arrows, and gave a small nod that did more than talk. A slow creak ran through the ropes in a way that meant the sails were drawing well enough, and that small sound kept shoulders from tightening. A bowl of rice went down the line, and no one took more than his share. The head man reminded the clerk to watch the horizon and keep the signal flags ready. Sailors told a simple joke about waves that never sent a bill, and people smiled without taking their eyes from the work. Such talk kept the heart from jumping too fast. Late in the day, a low black shape rose off the quarter, and the lookout lifted the signal. The convoy did as taught, holding its neat line but easing so the readiest sterns could face the threat. The captain gave a hand sign to put the ship just right, not too far, not close enough to tempt iron hooks. There had been stories in the city about boats that came like ghosts, but the truth stood on the water. Long oars worked hard, and men in a rough craft meant to use speed to force a choice. The guard crew at the stern opened the pine buckets and dragged wet along the rail and deck, more to keep sparks from taking hold than to look busy. A comrade pushed a small rack into place and felt for the cords that bound the arrow shafts. The clerk put the tallies away without being told and went to the chain that hung near the rail, ready for a cut if a hook found a bite. A sharp smell of pitch rose as a pot was opened for sealing and smearing, and it spoke of simple tools doing old work. There had been times on land when one could bargain, but the sea left little room. A boat that closed too fast was not here to trade. Still, the mind kept to steps and did not leap ahead. The fast boat came on in a slant, and the officer at the stern called for the bowman to ready the first shot. A pair set their arrows to small rings of rag, each one dipped with care, and another man brought a small jar to wet the deck once more. A wick took light and ran along the shaft like a little ribbon, and hands grew sure with a task that had been shown a dozen times on calm days. One said a word under his breath, not as a spell but as a habit that made the hands steady. The order came plain and strong, and the first fire arrow went out and traced its arc toward the water ahead of the oncoming boat. Smoke stung the throat as more wicks were lit, and the men held their place without hurry. The helmsman kept the stern facing the threat, so the shooters had a clean field, and that took a quiet courage most do not praise. Hooks showed at the pirate bow, and one could read the plan. They aimed to throw, catch, and pull, but the line held, and the space between ships stayed wide enough to choose the terms. That was the heart of seamanship then. Choose the field within the small circle given. The first arrow kissed the sea and died, but the next set a small bright path that ran straight to wood and stuck. Men on the small boat stamped and hands fumbled with a bucket, and that bought a breath. The guard crew did their work like a drill, steady and simple, and a second volley went out, not at men but at oars and bows that drove the speed. A mate cut a thrown rope before it could bite, and a pole went out to push the nearest reach away, and the ship kept her course in a way that told the other boats where to be. The glare of flame on the water made the shapes sharp for a moment, and a comrade did not waste that moment. A second junk slipped a little across the rear to send plain arrows where they counted, and then eased back into place so no gap opened in the line. Fear had a seat on the deck, but it did not chair the meeting. The captain's hand signs said as much as words, and each one meant both threat and mercy. Hold, wait, then act. Work beat panic. That was the way it went when trained hands were asked to do what they had practiced without an audience. The pirate craft veered, then tried again, this time aiming for the space between the tail ship and the next. The helmsman answered, and the stern kept its clean face to the threat. As taught, a hook flew and rang against the rail but slipped, and a second found a loop and held for a breath. Steel flashed as a man cut the line fast and clean, and the ship did not lose her step. The small boat's oars worked harder, and two men lifted boards as if to screen their mates, and that told more than any speech. A coil of chain went over the side to drag as a brake for a moment, making the nearest foe misjudge and slide past. More arrows flew, not wild, but paced to mark time. A heavy bag of sand rolled to shift weight just enough for the turn, a trick shown by older hands long ago. A short spear stayed near the rail, ready for the last moment if it came, but that moment did not come just yet. A dull thump ran underfoot as hull met a stray plank, and folk steadied their knees in a way that said they had learned how to stand. Even in a hard hour, no one forgot that a clear head saved more than a hard arm. A second pair of small boats hovered, reading the play and waiting for a mistake, but the convoy did not offer one. The lead ship eased just enough to hint at a trap, and then the middle ship filled the space with her stern, keeping the arrows trained while saving room to turn. The fast boat that had taken flame now lagged, and its mates did not hate it enough to press without it. The guard crew did not cheer. They knew that pride wasted breath. A few more shots went out, and each bowman aimed for oars and ropes, not for grand triumphs. The captain signaled a slow gather, so the thin places closed, and the whole line shortened by a little so no one ship wore the weight. The pirate craft swirled to think it over, then drew back, and the sea took back the space between us. The taste of brine sat on the lips while the bow lifted and fell, and the old calm began to return like a friend at the door. That was mercy enough for one day. The clerk brought out the tally again, not to count fear, but to count what still travelled with us. It was good to measure what had not been lost. When the lights softened, repairs were set in a plain order. A man checked for stray sparks where the smeared deck had kept them from biting, and another set hands to a broken loop at the rail. The guard crew stacked the bows and tied the bundle tight, and the officer took a quiet word with the captain that ended with a nod. A small pot of rice went around, and a few grains clung to damp fingers, and that small task felt like a return to the right path. Stories came up the way they always did after danger, but they were told without swagger. Some said the sea were filled with demons, and some said it was only men in boats, and most agreed that habit and clear signals had made the choice for us. No one sang loud, but a humming rose as the night work began, and that was enough company. A sheet was mended, a line was spliced, and the watch was set in a way that let tired bodies lie down. The day's lesson was not new. Plan the work, keep the line, use fire to break speed, and do not chase. That had been the way of things since long before our time. A few glanced west and thought of home, and the thought did no harm. Chapter 9, West by Hormuz and Trebizond. The posting yard at Hormuz had a bare strip of shade and a plank where a purse went open. and coins knocked together in a thin rhythm. The clink of small silver made clear how far the journey had stretched the means at hand. A clerk leaned close and counted again, and the calloused fingers across from him slid back a pair of worn dirham and called it even. A route had to be chosen with care, and the choice pressed like a thumb on the scale. The sea still waited with its tricks, yet the coast ahead had rough waters and not much promise. The road offered steps that could be measured one by one, and a fair price spoke louder than a proud promise. A scribe scratched a note for the toll gate and nodded to the packmaster, and the old tablet of safe conduct hung under a sleeve where strangers could see it if they wished. A ferry pulled off the mud, and the last of the eastern coins found a new owner. A glance passed between kin, and the sense in it was simple. West was the way, even with a light purse and a heavier roll of duties. It seemed wiser to trust the ground and the habit of trade. That was the way of things when miles still waited. Morning on the desert road started before light, when hooves and padded feet asked for movement, and men did not argue. A long line formed past the wells, and the first hours went to finding a pace that did not break animals or tempers. The throat went dry as the air took what it wanted and gave nothing back. A driver near the head told a joke he had told before, and the last wagons found a laugh in it, because the road felt shorter when sound moved down the line. Toll posts stood with their gates half open, watched by men who liked a neat account and a neat hat. Nothing about it felt cruel. It was what kept the way safe enough for strangers. A stone marker, half sunk and half chipped, showed where names of kings had once covered the face. No one read them now, yet the stone still did its job and steadied the mind. A clerk in the second town weighed the purse and said there was passage for the train if no load ran over. That was fair, and a fair word carried farther than a hard one on a long day. So it went, step by step. The land lifted in slow folds after the flats, and the dust turned thin as the earth grew stony and grey. The walled inn took the line in by measure, 1 yard at a time, and a corner near the gate made a good spot for notes and small sums. A cook put a pot on the fire and worked with what he had, and a sour bite of yogurt cut the taste of boiled grain and helped it down. Talk rested on easy things because heavy talk made rest heavy too. Stories from the East had a shine to them in a place like this, but there was no harm in that. People had earned a bit of wonder with their labor. A trader from the north asked about paper notes and whether they truly stood like coin, and the answer went simple. They did, where the laws and the seals stood behind them. One man hummed a scrap of song while he wiped his spoon clean, and the sound fit the mood of the court and the tired beasts that drifted to sleep. The gate shut with a familiar thud, and the heads on the wall watched the road without fuss. The night held, and the miles waited kindly. Rest had its own work to do, and it did it well enough. Beyond the plateau, the road met mountains that climbed in patient ribs, and the path took its time and refused to be hurried. The teamsters set a rule for the narrow places, and the carts backed and moved like schoolboys who had done this drill every year. The white line of snow on a far crown kept steady for days, as if it meant to mark the point where everything turned toward the sea again. A wheel came loose on a bend, and 4 hands made it right before the next man could offer advice. The ledges asked for quiet steps and fewer boasts, and the beasts did not need to be told twice. A tollman asked for a silver and a promise to carry no quarrel into the next valley, and the promise was easier to give than the coin. A shepherd stood above with a hooked staff and looked down without care for where strangers had come from or where they meant to go. The measure of the road was not high talk but steady care. That was sound work, and sound work had brought the company this far already. The first sight of Trebizond came like a seal on a long message. The towers squared against the water and the roofs set low behind the walls. The smell of tar rose from the wharf where repair crews worked with firm strokes and a way of speaking that kept the pace even. A new set of faces met the train, and the harbour clerk asked plain questions about load, weight and truth. Words turned to rates without heat, and coin changed hands with a nod. The purse held enough for passage and a small cask to bring to the next port, and that was grace after so many miles. A money man gave a rate on a bright Byzant, and the gold winked at the simple plan to go west by the inland sea. There was sense in taking rest under a known wall before trying a lane of water. The horses blew and grazed, and men stood in small knots to speak of winds and captains who knew their business. It seemed right to trust a steady craft and a skipper with grey hair more than a boast and a fast hull. That was how a road turned into a voyage without fuss. A narrow-decked ship lay at anchor with a crew that moved like a family, each one knowing the next man's habit. The lines took a strain, and the old wood gave a soft creak that set its own rhythm for the day. The pilot spoke of headlands and a way to skirt a rough patch that liked to throw a surprise, and no one mocked the warning. Wind held well, and the coast turned from rock to low ground and back again, as if a hand drew it new each hour. A boy from the port kept count of the meals and passed the bowl as if the job were a badge, and the bowl came back clean each time because food on water tasted like a promise kept. A man from the south told the tale of a prince who had lost a crown and found a quiet farm, and the laugh came not at the prince but at the peace he liked in the end. Nets went over at dusk, not for trade but to pass the hour, and 2 small fish came up to nods and a fair division. No one asked more of the sea than it would give, and that was wisdom hard learned on other coasts. Constantinople rose with walls that had seen more years than the men who guarded them, and the narrow strait made a funnel for every plan and every prayer. A clerk in a small room set out a sheet and a neat pen, and wax grew warm under a seal that closed a short letter to kin who were already moving goods toward the homeward quay. A broker in the market spoke a line of Greek and then a line of the tongue of the West, and the sums took shape in both without trouble. There was not much to juggle now, which was a kind of rest in itself. A boatman pointed to a seat and a price and took none of the pride that would have cost another coin. A look at the masts in the harbour made it clear that the next leg was simple enough, and a simple path was welcome. Arrangements rested on small trust and small proof, and both were in reach. The city had seen men come and go with plans larger than their means, and it had outlasted them all. That was a comfort in a place that measured days by tides and bells. The last reach toward the west felt less like a push and more like a homeward pull, steady and without tricks. The deck gave a small sway that grew familiar by the second day, and a watch took turns at the bow while talk slid to old streets and faces that would still be there. A cool wind touched the cheek at dawn and asked no fee for the favor. The captain kept the shore in sight when he could and trusted open water when he had to, and no man argued with good sense. Plans for the next season stirred because plans were the way a trader kept a hand on hope without roaming too far ahead. There would be time to count gains and losses under a roof, with papers in order and a warm room to catch the words before they thinned in the air. The long way across had given a story as real as a tally and as light as a laugh. Soon enough, there would be a quiet place to set it down for a man with a quick pen. That was the path forward, as the wake pointed home. Chapter 10. Telling the Tale in Captivity. It had been months in a Genoa cell after ships met and one crew lost. Chains and tally marks marked the days, yet talk still moved. Rusticello sat across, a man who shaped tales for courts and roads. He asked for the journey to the Far East, and the voice answered with names of passes, cities, and long tracks. You spoke as one who had carried packs and notes, steady and without rush. The scratch of a quill beat time, while thoughts lined up, counted, and began to flow. Prisoners had argued nearby, but this corner kept a calm work that was a small grace. Captivity closed doors, yet memory opened gates. That was true in many lives. War had taken one freedom, and words offered another, so the work went on without hurry. A life on the road had carried weight, and now the burden turned into lines that might outlast old arguments. Chains had their own order, but a story had one as well. The writer smiled at small jokes, and the teller held back the boast, knowing that plain speech would do. A young face had long ago left the lagoon, and an older one now found a way to set it straight. It was odd how it all had come together, but travel had trained patience, and patience served here too. That was the way of things. The telling began at the start, as it should. There had been a quay, a ship, a father, and an uncle with plans, and a letter meant to smooth paths in the Levant. A galley had hugged the coast, and the sea had seemed both friend and judge. A pope had sent a paper with a seal, and that paper had eased doors at Acre when people grew wary. The mouth had been young then, quick to answer and slow to think, but kindness from strangers had taught better ways. The taste of the prison bread now made a small bridge back to ship rations and lean meals, and it set the mind steady for old facts. Fame later had dressed those days with bright cloth, yet the truth had been simple. Carry news, learn the price of pepper, keep good notes, serve kin, and look for a road north and east. It had been enough. Rustichello had nodded, seeing worth in steady steps, and had asked for a line that showed sense to those who had never left home. So the story took plain shape. It showed small duties first, and it saved the wonders for their time, because a road made more sense when one walked it yard by yard. That was only fair. In such order, a long trip could be understood and trusted by any reader. It had moved on to land where the sea could not carry a man. Caravans had turned from weak hulls at Hormuz and followed guides through Kerman, and later climbed toward high passes. A token had done as much work as a sword, and that token had been the paisa, a plate that told keepers to help and watchmen to stand aside. You explained how a postkeeper had checked it, how a clerk had frowned and then waved a hand when the sign matched the rules. Rustichello had held the odd word on his tongue to fit it to his page, and he had grinned at the thought of it. The smell of ink had risen as he wrote it, and the scene had come back in full order. A post house, a keeper with rules, fresh mounts waiting only after names were checked and dues were shown. There had been broth, and there had been jokes, and there had been relief when saddles were shifted and straps were tied right. The road had not been magic. It had been a chain of good habits under law, with human weakness here and there, and with mercy now and then as well. That was worth saying. It calmed the reach for legend and set the work back on firm ground. Rustichello had agreed, and had marked where more care was needed, and the next lines had moved on at a steady pace. A comrade in memory had ridden beside, but it had been duty that kept the caravan in shape. City days had come next in the tale, when work had been set by a great ruler far to the east. Halls had held scribes and officials, and paper money had moved from hand to hand with seals that kept order. Questions had been plain: which roads held, which bridges failed, which storehouses filled, and which ran low. That had been the real strength, not some spell, but a habit of asking simple things and waiting for straight answers. Rustichello had thought men would want wonders, yet he had also seen that steady rule made its own kind of marvel. He had shaped the talk so that both sat side by side without foolish paint. The lamp gave a small glow on the desk, while numbers and names were set down in a way common folk could follow. Travelers had a right to a map they could trust, even if no map lay in their hands. So the talk had told of ferries, guards, fairs, and 100 small signs by the road that had kept lives moving. A flawed day had been marked as flawed. A fair day had been marked as fair. That balance had been the best answer to rumor, and it had eased the heart more than any boast. It had stood firm. Of course the hard turns had to be told. There had been a ring of camels in a high pass when bandits tested a train with feints and fast shots, and guards had braced their line the way they had been taught since fathers learned from fathers. Later, a patrol on the steppe had formed a wedge and sent a hard rain from afar before closing to push raiders off the baggage. Still later, out on the sea road, a watch crew on a trading ship had thrown fire from the stern and turned a lean pirate boat aside. You did not polish fear into pride or make luck into skill. You laid out how lines held and why leaders called for this move and not that one. The weight of the shackle on the ankle kept the teller from moving about as the scene was laid out, but that stillness helped words land right. It had been work to speak of fear in plain terms and not let it swell, and it had been a duty to show the craft of many men who had done their part cleanly. That was fair to them and fair to the truth. A pause came after each turn, even here, and a breath could be taken before the next line. That was how it had gone. Yet the best parts had not been fights. Camps had held games with stones and simple tricks, and towns had shared fares with small wagers that made a hard week easier. A bowl of soup had been passed around at high camps, and a cup had marked simple exchanges in courtyards where traders weighed chances. Small tricks had made long nights pass under awnings while someone was amused by a mule that could count. The soft hum that came from Rustichello had kept the moment easy while the line was set down. He had asked for a few words of talk in the tongues met along the way, and the teller had given them, but only enough to mark respect. No one needed a pile of rare terms to feel the sense of a nod, a bow, or a half smile. There had been a rule to keep faces safe and tempers even, and it had worked more often than not. A guard had leaned in at the share of an old lesson and had let it pass, and that had kept the room kind. Trust was a currency too. That was worth more than a coin on many days. Such small mercies kept men willing to help on lonely roads. They carried on because kindness made travel safer than fear did. Soon the talk had turned to how the world would hear it. Rustichello had known what courtiers liked, and he had urged a brighter thread now and then. The teller had held the line, and had asked that marvels be used only where they had been seen or weighed with care. A strange animal could be placed in a market or a gift hall, but a miracle had to earn its keep. The edge of the page felt rough under one thumb as cuts were made and plain facts were kept. Names of men who had helped were set in a good light, and places where mistakes had been made were owned in a steady tone. This was no sermon, and no boast. It was a record shaped for common folks who might never see those roads, that had calmed the spirit. You checked pride, and you thinned shame to the truth it deserved. A boy who had left home had returned a man who could make light of himself, and that had helped the words stand. It had been right to care about balance. Too much sugar had never made a meal better. Rustichello had trimmed a flourish here and there, and he had pointed to places where a question would rise in a listener's mind. That guidance had helped set the steps in a line that any sailor or porter could follow. Memory had a way of bending to pride, but work on the page had straightened it. That was the honest bargain. By the time the last page neared, the two of them had settled into a craft that felt honest. A guard had come and gone without fuss, and the day had moved along with its own small rhythm. Rustichello had sanded a sheet and set it aside, and the teller had chosen one more scene that gave the shape of a life. A market at home, a canal under a warehouse wall, a mother's table, a father's nod. Not everything had been in reach anymore, but enough had come back to make sense of the years. The quiet in the cell rested like a third man at the table, while talk trailed off and plans for the next day were set. Pages would walk farther than feet could travel, and that was a comfort. Work did not end when gates shut. Work changed its form and waited for hands. One last note had been made to thank those who had carried loads and kept watch, from the postkeeper to the ship hand who had known when to reef. Then the quill had been set down. That had been the close of the day, and sleep had been earned, and hope had been kept for what might come after. In the morning, the work would start again, and that had been enough. And so, our travels with Marco Polo draw to an end. The caravans rest, the cities grow distant, and the stories remain to be told again, until our next journey together. Rest well, dream deep, and good night.